But for now, let's do the next part of the essay, which is Geula. So that's page 183. This is on the topic of Geula, redemption. So this kind of fits in because we have been speaking about the progression of ideas from the creator, from the creator to the creation, to the purpose of creation, for the nature of good and evil and free will, the nature of the body and soul, reward and punishment, things having to do with spirit, the spiritual realm, souls, angels, demons, forces. Then going into a discussion that we saw most recently, tapping into the light side of the force with prophecy. And this would be Geula, which would be the resolution of the different types of conflicts and contradictions that we're discussing. In Geula, the redemption, things are going to be reconciled. And then the next topic is going to be related to Niso's Hebrew namesake, which is regarding Nisim, miracles, and then just some other ideas about Torah and Shas and whatnot. That'll conclude the essay. So let's do Geula. Geula on page 183. Hine. Mivchar Amin Enoshi Hu Israel. The elevated member of the human race is Israel. Vu'am ha'me'utodim l'dveikus bo yisborach. This is a people who is in future relegated towards dveikus, cleaving to God. V'roi lehem shehiu me'utorim bi'iturei kedusha gedola, and it is befitting, therefore, that they be crowned with great crowns of holiness. V'tiyeh shchinoso yisborach shor elehem, and that God's presence should dwell upon them. Umistabekes bam, and cleave to them. Shishtalmu b'zeh, and in this way they will become perfected. Ad sheyizku l'tova amitis, until they will fully receive the good and proper reward. So, the truth is that many of the Jewish sources indicate that it was God's intention that Adam and all of his descendants, meaning Adam and Eve, mankind, and all of Adam and Eve's descendants, should be deserving of this status, this very elevated status of a perfect and complete cleaving to God, being enveloped in the light and the holiness of the presence of God. And this was the idea that was intended if Adam and Eve had just refrained from transgressing that first fatal Friday. But since they fell, world history, the spiritual history of mankind changed greatly. But it's important to know that God's initial intention was that all of humanity should be one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and spirituality for all. Yeah? And that Adam and Eve, if they had refrained from transgressing that first fatal Friday, they would have perfected themselves, realized the purpose for which they were created, and then brought their progeny into the world into a state of perfection. And that would have been the bringing into fruition of the whole purpose for creation. And there would be no distinction between nations. The distinction between nations only took place much later, at the generation of the dispersal, when humanity built this Tower of Babylon. And as a result of this, God punished them by babbling their language, confusing them and causing them to disperse across the globe. But until then, they were still one nation, one nation of humanity. And they still had the opportunity to rectify what Adam and Eve caused to go wrong. Only after this Tower of Babylon, which represents the human inclination to create an edifice which they can delude themselves into thinking elevates them into heaven and enables them to usurp the power of God utilizing their God-given quality of being God-like, because we were created B'Tselem Elokim. But this inclination of which was imbued within us, having been created B'Tselem Elokim, which we've explained a bit in the past, means being created specifically not in the tselem of Yud, Hey, Vav, and Hey, which is the creator, but rather B'Tselem Elokim, which denotes God's power of mastership and rule, kingship over creation. And therefore, mankind is given this kind of power, having been created B'Tselem Elokim. They have the power of Elokim. And that can cause mankind to have an inclination to want to gain control instead of God. And that's what this Tower of Babylon was. This Tower of Babel was built, quote unquote, by human beings to wage war against God, to bring themselves up into heaven with spears and knives and kill God and pull God out of heaven. Right? Physically, maybe there was such a building, maybe there wasn't, but certainly metaphorically, the message then is no less true today, which is that human beings have all types of constructs which we make and we fabricate in order to elevate our own importance, bring ourselves up into the realm of the divine, the all-powerful. We make all types of tools which are used to deconstruct God, to remove God's existence, as it were, to kill God and take God out of heaven and place ourselves there instead. And this Tower of Babylon is what causes a person to go as far away from God as is possible. It deflects a person from the true purpose of being created, which was to cleave to God, and it brings about divisiveness and distinction and separateness and separation and distance, right? And the irony of it all is that it all comes from the very power which should actually put us in a trajectory in the opposite direction, towards God. The fact that we were created B'Tselem Elokim is simultaneously what would enable us to actually cleave to God if we recognize that power and harness it with humility towards discovering and connecting to God. So that we're walking on this tightrope, this type of double-edged sword here, this type of the edge of a sword, where it can go one way or the other way, towards cleaving and connection to God, or towards separation and distinction from God. But initially, all of humanity was given this opportunity to cleave to God. And that's what God wanted them to choose. God wanted them to choose to cleave to God. And that was the whole trial there, because Adam and Eve knew why they were created. They knew that they were created for the purpose of connecting to God, making themselves God-like. In order to make themselves God-like, they had to be able to connect to God in all ways possible. All venues should be to their access. They should access all venues in order to cleave to God and fulfill that purpose. And then when they found themselves placed in a reality, a plane of existence, which offered them access in all ways, metaphorically referred to as being able to eat the fruit, taste the fruit of all of the trees of the Garden of Eden, which represents the ability to taste God through all of the different various and variegated experiences in life. The fact that they were barred from doing so in one way was antithetical to their understanding for the reason for which they were created, which was to cleave to God. And Adam and Eve were distraught over this. And they were sitting there like Mordecai is sitting. Yeah? Who sculpted that famous sculpture, The Thinker? What was that? No idea. You know the statue.
I've seen it.
Yeah, was it Michelangelo? I don't know. In any case, Giovanni? What?
I think it was done relatively
Recent modern times?
like 300 years ago.
Yeah, The Thinker. Anyway, this is how it goes. Yeah, so that's how it is. Yeah? So Adam and Eve found themselves bewildered in this garden of tantalizing experiences and venues through which they could connect to God, yet being prevented from doing so in all ways. One of the experiences was blocked for them. They could not gain knowledge and connectedness to God through the knowledge of good and evil. And Adam and Eve are like really beside themselves, like, okay, this is intolerable. God created us for the purpose of being able to connect Him in all possible ways. And he did so by giving us this multitude of experiences through which we can cleave to God. But this one right there, that's central, in the midst of the garden, that central this experience, it doesn't make sense. Comes along the seductive serpent and says, what's bothering you guys? What are you so down in the face about? God's created you. You should be very happy. So Adam, in his naive state, revealed to the sly and slick-tongued serpent, the problem is we were created here for the purpose of connecting, and God is not allowing us to connect. Oh, that's unthinkable. How unfortunate. I understand why you must be so upset. What's the matter? He said, well, there's this tree, this experience of understanding God and good and evil, which is so central in realizing one's purpose in life, and God is not allowing us to connect Him in this way. So the serpent says to them, God, you're really naive. Don't you get it? What would happen if you partook of this experience? So Adam looks to Eve and says, well, God said we're going to die. She's like, yeah, no, we're going to die. You really think you're going to die? Would God have created you for the purpose of cleaving to Him in all ways, including every possibility, like partaking of the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil? And if you partake of that with the intention of connecting to Him, He would kill you for that? You got it wrong. He wants you to have the fruit. That's the purpose for which you were created. Only He wants to test you and see whether you want Him so bad, you want to cleave to God so thoroughly that you're willing to do it even under the threat of death. It's not that He doesn't want you to partake. He wants you to partake. And when you partake, you'll taste life. He just wants to know that you're really willing to sacrifice your life for that purpose. So Adam and Eve are like, wow, that makes sense. Yeah. And then they start thinking, you know what? Look, we got two options. We can either continue without it, but what is life worth without connecting to God on all levels? It's tantamount to death. On the other hand, maybe the serpent's right, and God really does want us to take of this experience, and it's a test, in which case we'll have life. So that either way we go, it's going to work. Yeah? Because if we take it, we'll get life. And if we take it and we have death, so life without it is tantamount to death anyway. So either way you slice it, it comes up, right? Taste it. So in this way, they were intellectually seduced into partaking of this experience. And we all know what happened. Yeah, that was that fatal mistake that they made the final few minutes before Shabbos came in. And rather than perfecting themselves, they were demoted. If until that time, as the Midrash said, they were on earth, but reaching to heaven, they could be on one side of the earth and see what's going on the other side of the earth. They had great spiritual stature, so much so that the angels mistook them for God. And the Midrash says, the angels wanted to say, Kadosh, 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 pronounce the Kedusha before Adam, this being of light. That's how elevated Adam and Eve's souls were. After this point, the Gemara says, God placed His hand on them and pressed them down. Pressed them down, 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 into the material world. And these beings of light became beings of darkness, or opaque, beings of opaqueness. And this is where it was all lost. But the sources say that the serpent was actually telling them the truth.
So if they didn't eat from the tree, the life on earth would be a lot different right now.
If they had not eaten, if they had not have partaken of that experience at that time, but rather would have waited until the appointed time, then things, of course, would have been much different. That was the point here, that the Kabbalistic teachings tell us that the serpent was telling the truth.
Would you say that
This line of reasoning actually was based in truth, and God did intend for them to partake of this experience for exactly the purpose that the serpent argued, in order to enable mankind to cleave to God entirely in all ways. Only It had to have to. The intention was that it be after Adam and Eve passed the test of refraining from partaking of the experience.
So you would
Even
think-
though intellectually there was every rational reason for them to go ahead and put out their hands and take this fruit, right? And there was truth in that because that's ultimately what God wanted. But He wanted them first to perfect themselves by refraining, humbly accept upon themselves the kingship of Hashem, and had they affected their own perfection that Friday, you know what God would have given them for their Shabbos meal?
That's fruit.
Was that?
That's fruit.
Yes, not couscous.
No, that fruit.
Yes, not couscous, that fruit. You're right. That fruit. And their Shabbos meal would have consisted of the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And after having perfected themselves in that perfected state of that first primordial Shabbos, they would have ushered in a period of perfection. And you know what they would have been given for dessert? The compote?
Snakes.
No, not couscous, but the fruit of the tree of life. Of life.
What's the blessing on those two fruit?
Good question.
It's Chaim and it's which one is it? Why they don't take it as Chaim? Why they take it as the
Well, first they had to bring themselves to the level where they could incorporate the knowledge of good and evil as is fused within God, and when they would attain that level of perfection, they would be granted eternal life. So that was the sequence.
Were they not created perfect though? Like,
No, they were created with the potential for perfection, which they had to actualize.
so that's why they felt that their lives were lacking something at that
Yes,
point.
yes.
Okay.
Would you say that guy who convinced them to eat off the tree was the Yitzhahara?
Yeah, that force was the Satan, it was the Yetzirah, it was the Nachash.
Didn't he convince?
They take different
Chava?
forms. What's that?
Didn't he convince Eve?
Yeah,
and then Eve told him.
Yeah, she and him, but they were in many ways one, even though at that point they had already been separated. But this was the argument that the serpent used to seduce her, and she conveyed that to him.
She
And
really also seduce her sexually too.
Okay.
Yeah.
The Sefer HaBehir says that. Yes, that's brought down in the Sefer HaBehir. I mean, many of the sources say that the Nachash Heitil ba zehuma, or zehumaso, that he injected within her his impurity, and more directly, that's referring to persuading her with this impure line of reasoning, injecting his impurity into her soul or into her thoughts. But on another level, there's an implication that there was some type of a sexual interaction there as well. What's that? It wasn't a snake. I intended to call it a serpent. I hope I did. But it's not a snake. We call it a nachash. We call it a nachash, but it wasn't a snake. It was some sly, slick creature, which was very insidiously seducing, and it spoke with an S.
What's the difference between a snake and a snake?
I don't know. I'm just saying serpent is, but I didn't want to avoid as much as possible conveying the idea that it was a snake. It was some type of being, some type of a being or a force. It was embodied. It could have been that it was evil incarnate.
How did God punish it?
So it's very interesting.
Hashem told the
The Torah says that God cut its legs and caused it to crawl on its belly and eat dust.
Speak anymore.
What's that?
It took away.
Took away its speech. Very interesting. Maybe that's the idea of it's eating dust, like its throat becomes choked and inability.
So up until that moment, until before the serpent seduced them, they weren't aware of Hashem.
They were what?
They weren't aware of Hashem.
They were in.
They weren't
They
aware.
weren't aware of Hashem.
Oh, aware. They were not aware of Hashem. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I'm asking.
They were very much aware of Hashem. Why do you say that they were not aware of Hashem?
Because what serpent said was to know Hashem. That was what
They
you said.
would be like Hashem.
Yes. What this commentary is saying is that the serpent came to say to them that in fact God wanted them to partake of this fruit, and that was God's plan, that they do so in order to be able to cleave to God entirely in all possible ways, that there should be no barrier whatsoever between they and God. And when the serpent said that, the serpent was telling the truth. That was God's plan, but not at that time. Until they heard from God otherwise, partake of this experience, they had to go on what God clearly communicated to them, which was, do not partake of this experience. And you cannot rationalize or justify doing something which God told you not to, even if it seems like it's the right thing to do. It's kind of like a metaphor that's given about two kings, and each boasted about the dedication of their servants. So the one king said to the other, well, let's see how dedicated and loyal your servant actually is. And they made a bet between them, some type of a wager. How does it go? I don't remember exactly the details of it, but it was basically like this. The servant should be sent from one king to the other, entrusted with 1,000 gold coins. And he was to deliver these coins. For some reason right now I'm kind of blanking on the details of the story, but ultimately what happened was that the king said, listen, I'll give you 10,000 of these coins in their stead. You give me 1,000, I'll give you 10,000 instead. And so the servant said, well, I came to get 1,000 coins from my master, but I can orchestrate things in a way where I could actually come back with 10,000 coins. So in this way, he was duped into taking those 10,000 coins. He brought back to his king, and his own king was furious. He said, I made a wager with him that you wouldn't do that at the expense of 100,000 coins. So you might have earned me 10,000, but you've actually caused me to lose 90,000, which means that we have limited perspective and we don't really know what's going on, right? We have to do what we're told. And we do not have the liberty to justify and rationalize God's commandments and what He wants us to do and what He doesn't want us to do unless we hear otherwise. And that's basically what was happening here. The serpent was saying the truth, and he caused them to justify and rationalize doing something in the name of that truth, which God actually prohibited from doing. Had they refrained from doing so, they really would have gotten the gold. Yeah, but the hands are popping up. I think you had yours up a while ago.
Yeah,
and we'll go on this
the question that's on my mind is, you say that they defy God's will.
Right.
But surely it was God's will.
That they partake of that fruit?
Before Shabbos, that's what
No.
happened, and that was God's will. Because everything is pre-planned. And
That's not true. No, that's not true.
what's not true?
That everything is pre-planned. They have free will,
They have free will, but God has foreknowledge of what choices they're going to make.
which doesn't preclude them having made that decision.
True.
But God really wanted, God's intention was that they refrain from exercising their free will in that way. But He also made a contingent plan, right?
So God has
to consider
infinite variation of plans.
Sure,
depending on what choices
sure,
they're gonna make.
sure. And there was a condition here that if they didn't, which He knew, as it were, from the outset that they wouldn't, right? Then He created a contingent plan, and that's where we are. We're in contingent plan, and the result of all this, right? God pressed them down. Human beings became much more physical and much less spiritual, and that led to an even further distancing of humanity from God, which ultimately resulted in people's using this residual power of Tselem Elokim to try and replace God, and then the dispersal in the different nations. I'm just trying to point out here what he's saying is that Israel is the distinguished of nations. But the truth is, Israel is a spiritual concept which was initially intended for all of humanity and only became later concentrated among the Jewish people. Yeah.
Why do we not hate Adam? We hate Haman and Hitler. He destroyed the whole universe.
Well, I mean, he made a tragic mistake, but certainly according to this way of explaining things, he was actually well intentioned. And he messed up big time, but that's no way to hate him. But we certainly are enjoined to learn from his mistake.
But we speak about him like he was like someone great.
He was a spiritual giant, and this Kabbalistic explanation of the way things happened, in my mind, kind of addresses this point, which was, if they were such spiritual giants, how could they have made such a simple, obvious mistake that none of us would make? If God told you, don't do it, how could you possibly do it? particularly when you're on that level. So I was trying to portray the spiritual agony and anguish that they felt as a result of not fulfilling their spiritual mandate of cleaving to God, and on their level, the rationalization that they came to accept in order to do what God told them not to do, in the name of thinking that that was what God actually wanted them to do in order to fulfill their purpose for being created. It's quite subtle.
So it was just the biggest mistake.
It was like the biggest mistake in history, big time.
Do we, like, let's say when Moshiach comes and Adam comes back, is everyone going to just hate him?
Not hate him, but it's interesting that you mentioned when Mashiach comes over the zone. That's why I'm kind of introducing our whole discussion here on redemption with this topic, because this is really the beginning of redemption. Is really, the beginning of redemption is exile, and exile is the banishing of Adam and Eve from Eden.
Are they going to come back?
Sure.
Oh, they are.
Sure.
We are part of Adam, though. How does that make sense that technically he's going to come back? We all from Adam.
You're part of Hashem.
So the answer is Adam will be resurrected. I didn't go into the detail whether there will be one body or whether Adam will be the body of resurrected humanity. But let's leave that aside for a minute. Yeah.
So, the serpent told them the truth, and also there's this concept that evil or bad was external before they ate from the tree. So, if good was all they had, was really this serpent coming to tell them the truth. It was as though they had no other option, that they would go with the serpent. If he's telling the truth, then evil is something that's external. Their ability to maybe think, oh, maybe this isn't how we're supposed to think.
Right.
They wouldn't be able to conceptualize that idea.
Well, let me try to understand your logic, because you're saying that they were essentially good, and the serpent was presenting to them essentially the truth. So,
Yes.
as good beings presented with the truth, they really had no option otherwise. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Is that the idea? Interesting idea. But it seemed to me that even though they were essentially good, they still did have the potential for evil. They were created with that potential. The Yetzer Hara had not been fully realized within them, and that's part of what we mean when we say the impurity of the serpent was injected into them, that the potential for evil was realized in them through their interaction with the serpent. That's one. And the second thing is that while the serpent told them the truth, he didn't tell them the whole truth. He told them the truth. He just didn't know the truth. It's the right thing, but he neglected to tell them it was the wrong time. Yeah, it was like sometimes I kind of try. I don't want to elaborate too much on the analogy, but sometimes to kind of make this dynamic a little more palpable, I think about the analogy of two people who meet. Let's say two people are convinced that they're the right ones for each other, but it turns out that they're both married to others. So what do they do with that dissonance? Do they act upon their intuitive impulse that they are one, or do they remain separate because they have joined with others? It's so right. How does they say it?
So right.
Feels so right to be. How does it go? Feels so right to be wrong. It's something. Yeah.
They have no idea what he's talking about.
So anyway, the point is, it could very well be that they are Mr. and Mrs. Right, but the time is not. The time is not right. So the Mr. and Mrs. Right is just not the right time. At some future time, if they're both available for one another, then they could realize what is the potential goodness between them. But until then, there's a prohibition of adultery. Just because they're soulmates doesn't permit adultery. Once the prohibition of adultery is removed, then the purpose of bringing these two souls together can be realized. Yeah.
So then, how are we supposed to look at bad being external? How are you supposed to understand that?
At that time, evil was a force which was primarily outside of themselves. And this evil force was trying to induce them, seduce them to doing something which denied God, which was rebellion against God.
So this was.
And they were swayed by that. Yeah, they were swayed by that because they could have said, "Listen, even though that makes perfect sense, we're essentially good beings, and we recognize the kernel of truth in what's being presented us. But on the other hand, God told us, don't do that." So really, rather than accepting the argument that God wanted them to demonstrate their faith and their love for God by sacrificing their lives for God, they should have done it the other way around, right? They should have sacrificed. I don't know. They should have rather than what did he kind of argue? God wants to see whether you're willing to sacrifice your lives to cleave to Him. So they should have sacrificed cleaving to Him in order to do what He says. That was the other side, and that's what they didn't choose.
So the test was, can you follow instructions?
Kind of like that.
Like the last test.
Yeah.
If you can follow instructions, you'll be perfect. But if you can't follow these simple instructions I laid out for you,
which is, even though there's very compelling, strong spiritual reasons to transgress, ultimately, we cannot second guess and rationalize God or the commandments, and therefore we have to do what we're told because we don't have the full picture. And there's another lesson that God intended to convey them, which is, you are poised to choose perfection and live accordingly for the rest of history. But there's an important lesson to learn before you get to that perfected state, which is, God is no less with you in your anguish and in your doubt and in your suffering. I see you in a quandary. I see you perturbed and disturbed over the fact that you're not able to cleave to me in what you understand to be all ways, and therefore you don't feel that you are entirely with me and that I'm entirely with you. But I want you to know that even in the dark times, even in the periods of doubt and uncertainty, I'm no less there with you than in the times when you think I'm very close. And, there's a well-known analogy. I'm not sure that the source is actually Jewish, but it's nevertheless significant words of wisdom. The analogy of a person who, after 120, is brought up before the heavenly court, and they show him a vision of his life. And this takes the form of footprints in the sand by the seashore. And he sees there are certain tracts of sand where there are two sets of footprints. And then there are certain parts where there's only one. And then there are two again. And God says to the person, this is a review of your life. How do you make sense of the fact that sometimes there are two sets of tracks and sometimes only one? And the person says, it's clear. The times when there are two, that's when you're going with me, God. And the times when there are one, that's when I was going it alone. The difficult, hard, right, dark times in life. God says, no, you got it wrong. The two sets is when we were going together. The one set is when I was carrying you. So this is the message that God intended to convey to them. Like I said, you are poised to cleave to me like this for the rest of eternity. But I want you to know that as God, I'm no less with you when you think we're not together as when we are together. And that was one of the important lessons that he wanted to teach them. Yeah.
So essentially, if Adam would have passed the test and not eaten the fruit on that Shabbos, God would have killed the serpent and evil would have been banished from creation.
God might not necessarily have killed the serpent, but God might have that decision might have elevated the serpent as well. So that the serpent actually might have been brought under servitude of Adam and Eve in their service of God. And this is related to this point about the Midrash saying that after they transgressed, God placed his hand on them and pressed them down so that they were congealed into more physical beings than the original spiritual beings that they had been. They were called beings of light. And afterwards they became enclothed with skin, the Torah says. The Arizal, the Kabbalah explains, it doesn't mean to say that God covered them with animal skin, but rather their beings were transposed from beings of light and with bodies of energy to bodies that were enclothed with skin, so that it represents the bodies materializing from a spiritual body into a physical body. And God pressed them down. And the question is, what happened to the serpent? We find that the serpent was also cut down. Why was this? Because when Adam and Eve were spiritually upright, supernal beings, so the serpent was also commensurately powerful to them and also an upright, stately creature. But when they transgressed and they were pressed down, so God had to press the power of evil down as well.
You think the serpent regret it?
What's that?
You think he regret it?
Did the serpent regret that?
Yeah.
Having caused them to transgress?
Yeah.
The serpent was doing its job.
So
It
if
did-
he's doing his job, why is it?
Why was it punished?
Yeah.
Right? Why was it punished? So the answer is, well, the fact that the serpent was cut down, is exactly the point I'm getting at, is not that the serpent was punished per se for persuading them. On the contrary, the serpent was just doing its job, and it did a great job. Yeah. The point is, once it succeeded in deflecting humanity from realizing that potential, of course, God didn't want that to happen, but the serpent was still doing its job to enable them to exercise their free will to choose either to or not to partake of this experience. But once he had done his job of dissuading them, then just as they were spiritually demoted, the serpent also had to be spiritually demoted so that he shouldn't be overwhelmingly powerful over humanity. And therefore, this is the idea. The serpent was cut down. What it means is, it was like Adam and Eve were pressed down into this world. The serpent was also pressed down and lowered so that its power and force of sway and persuasion over humanity should be diminished, commensurate to the level in which Adam and Eve's spiritual potential was also diminished. So according to this, it wasn't so much a punishment, but it was a necessary result of their transgressing. Why am I getting to all this? Because what I'm pointing is as follows, is that just like their spiritual decline or demise resulted in a diminishing of the power of the serpent, if they had actually realized their potential for perfection, then they would have elevated the serpent with them. Right? Just as the serpent was demoted with them, if they had elevated themselves, the serpent would have been elevated with them as well, to the point where it would have actually become a servant of Adam and Eve, and not a seducer of Adam and Eve, but actually a servant of them, and totally subservient to them. And this fits in with the idea that that Kadosh Baruch Hu says, and the Gemara tells us, Barasi Yetzirah, Ubarasi Torah Tavlin. I created the Yetzirah, and I created the Torah as a Tavlin for the Yetzirah, like an antidote to the Yetzirah. But the question is this: why doesn't it say something like this? I created the Yetzirah, and I created the Torah as a machete to cut it down, or I created the Torah as a fire to devour it. What kind of business? I created the Torah as a Tavlin. What is a Tavlin? A Tavlin is a spice.
More of it subdues it more than stops it.
Yeah, the Torah spices it up. What's that all about? The Torah spices up the Yetzirah. The point is, it's a spice in the sense that spices were used in olden times where the spice actually cured the meat, like salt cures meat. I created the Yetzirah, and I created the Torah as a way to cure, like a curing spice, the coarse quality of the Yetzirah in order to elevate it. So you see, the purpose is not to demolish, distinguish, and to eradicate the Yetzirah. The purpose is to elevate it and improve it and make it palatable. Yeah, in order to consume it, bring out the bad blood so that it can be palatable and beneficial. And I think this fits in with an idea that I once had, which is that if the serpent in Hebrew is referred to by the term Nachash, the gematria of Nachash actually equals Mashiach. So that you see that latent within the power of the Nachash is the power to bring about Mashiach. And that fits in very nicely with what we're saying here about the connection between the downfall and the redemption, because they're really two sides of the same coin. Within the Nachash, we actually have the potential for Mashiach, not by eradicating that potential for evil, but by harnessing its forces for good. And that's what the Gula is going to be all about. If Adam and Eve subjected themselves to the Nachash initially, the redemption is going to have to come about through reasserting their control, having been created B'Tselem Elokim, over all forces of existence, including evil. And when mankind is able to subjugate evil, they're actually going to be able to harness the power which is latent in the Nachash in order to actually use that very same power for the purpose of bringing about Mashiach.
So evil would have been taken out of the existence completely had it gone to plan.
Well, either it would no longer become evil, or it would be evil, but rather than it's being ra, it would be transformed into what's called Rea, which is a friend, a companion. Va'afta l're'echa kamocha. Love your friend like yourself. And there are certain commentaries say, Va'afta ra'acha kamocha. Love the evil within you as yourself, because that evil within you is part of yourself, and that evil is not intrinsically evil. It only becomes evil as a result of expressing that power in a negative way. But if you harness that power in a positive way, that ra b'cha actually becomes re'echa, your friend. And that's also what we're referring to here, is transmuting that nachash to Mashiach.
So post Moshiach, the world is going to go to the level of perfection that was always intended for Adam.
Yes, yes. Post Mashiach, which eventually is going to play out until Tchias Emesim, so that post resurrection will bring the world to the state that God had intended initially for Adam and Eve and all of their offspring to attain initially.
We'll become beings of light.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, and we'll no longer be interacting with each other as bodies, but as souls.
And that's which year is this? Is this from 6,000 to 7,000 or 7,000 onwards?
Well, it's all supposed to take place by the end of the year 6,000.
Oh, that we reach the perfection.
Yes, yes.
We've got a couple hundred years left.
Yeah, and then that millennia from 6 to 7 is going to be the world to come.
Dr. Golden said it's not an absolute fact; it has to be 6,000.
Okay.
So is that it could be?
If the Dr. Rabbi says so.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right, let me just end here. You're going to ask a question. Yeah, but I want to let people have a chance to take a break for the next class if they need to. And so if you have to go, and we'll continue B'ezrat Hashem tomorrow.